right. Well, we are started recording, and so I am going to go ahead and get started. Before we get started tonight, just a couple rules on etiquette on these things. We talked about this last week. If you want to ask a question, just unmute your mic, and usually there's a little microphone, and if you click on that, if it's white, you can talk. If it's red, you're muted. And it looks like everybody's muted except for Deborah right now. And I'm not hearing you, Deborah. So.
Okay,
there we go. Great. So just turn your microphone on if you want to ask a question. And then another good thing that you can do is you will also have, it says there's something about response, and it's a thumbs up or a clappy sign. If you like something or ask a yes or no question, you can do that too. You give a reaction. All right. Well, let's jump right in. I'm going to say a prayer. The Lord be with you. Gracious Father, thank you for our time together, and thank you for the teachings that we've had through this book, and thank you for Howard Thurman and his life and his ministry to us by these words. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, fantastic. Tonight we are on, chapter 5, talking about love. And we'll jump into the epilogue if anybody has any questions on that. It did wrap it up well, but didn't want to get a lot into the details of chapter 5. But I will dive right in. And from the very beginning, he just starts out, this is the first sentence in the chapter. The religion of Jesus makes the love ethic central. And one of the fascinating things, I think, for me as I read this chapter, is that this one was, instead of describing the disinherited or the weak or however, whatever adjective you want to use, it really is to the disinherited. It really is to the weak, to teach them how to love those who have been subjugating them or putting them down. And shifting the perspective was one of the things that made this chapter so powerful for me. And as he says here, it seems clear that Jesus started out with a simple teaching concerning love embodied in the timeless words of Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might, and thy neighbor as thyself. Once the neighbor is defined, then one's moral obligation is clear. And then it comes back to the rich young ruler who asked, who's my neighbor? Where's this out? You know, I'm looking for the fine print here on how we can look at this. And then Jesus, in response, gives the story of the Good Samaritan. And one of the things we often miss in that story is that the Samaritan was looked on as less than. So when the priest comes by, on his way to Jerusalem, very much about, most likely to serve in the temple, the one time he would get to do that in his life. He had been training his entire life. And if he had stopped to help the injured man on the road, he would most likely have been considered, not most likely, he would have been considered unclean and unable to serve in the temple. And so he was giving up his life's goal to help this guy, but he passes by on the other side of the road. The other religious leader, the scribe who comes along, does the same thing. And then Jesus puts out an idea for his listeners would have been anathema. Here we have someone who is the exact opposite of who they would consider righteous, a Samaritan. And if you don't know the history, when the Babylonian captivity took place and the Israelites were taken out of Israel and taken over to Babylon, and there for about 70 years, when they came back, the people who had stayed in the land and had intermarried and taken over everybody else's farms were the Samaritans. They were crossbreeds, half-bloods, if you watch or read the Harry Potter books, and they were considered less than because of that mingling of the blood and not staying pure and true. Because of that, they were banished from worshiping in the temple. If you remember the woman at the well who was a Samaritan, she talks about how we have to worship on these mountains around us, these high holy places. And you say we have to worship in the temple. But the Samaritan of all people acted like a neighbor, and Jesus says, go and do likewise. And that was shocking. It was scandalous when Jesus taught his followers to be like a Samaritan. Think whatever expletive you want to put in there, that was what Jesus was saying. The person that you consider less than is who I want you to be like. And it was pretty overwhelming. But here he talks about the idea of these basic commandments. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord with all your God, with all your heart, soul, and might, and thy neighbor as thyself. This whole thing of who are we to love? Love God with everything you've got, and your neighbor and yourself. Love them both equally. So the twofold demand was made upon him at all times. That is the person who is being taught here, the disinherited, to love those of the household of Israel who became his enemies because they regarded him as a careless perverter of the truths of God, and to love those beyond the household of Israel, the Samaritan, and even the Roman. So when Jesus was teaching folks how to love, once again, I was talking about how the Good Samaritan in his teachings, it was scandalous for the people who were there. And because of that, he was being rejected by the people he was closest to. Jesus did not consider himself anything other than a good Jewish boy, following the teachings that were timeless. He goes back and, just like other rabbis, would do midrash, commentary on these ancient teachings, explaining how to live them out in this day and time, just like I, as a preacher, try to do on Sundays. And because he was despised, because people saw him as being a traitor to the inherited traditions, not the inherited faith, but the way they lived them out. The people closest to him didn't like him. And then those that were considered the other, the Samaritan, once again, the historical and religious context that separated them. And then the Roman, the person who came in and were persecuting his people, that had power and dominion over his people. Likewise, he was calling to love both those within the household and those outside the household. So Jesus hammered out the vital content of his concept of love for one's enemies. The enemy can be very easily divided into three groups, and that's who we just talked about. The personal enemy, those closest to us who feel betrayed, that we're departing from the way they understand things are and should be. And then the Samaritans, who were considered the traitors, who had left the group long ago, and they deserved to be outside the group, the despised. And then the Romans, the empowered, and those that are empowered could either be religious or political in nature. And in Jesus' context, they were both. So the love of enemy means that a fundamental attack must first be made on the enemy status. An unscrambling process is required. I like when I was going over my notes that I had written in my margins, I wrote, instead of unscrambling, an untangling. I feel like so much of what we're talking about is that we've inherited and we've made a lot of knots. My daughter came to me with a spool of thread a couple of weeks ago. She was doing her knitting. And while she was doing her knitting, she made this wonderful knot. And I spent about 25 minutes trying to untangle this knot. And finally, I just said to Sojo, look, get some scissors. We're going to have to cut this out, because she had done such a wonderful job and trying to fix things made it worse, and that the knots were so tied up on themselves they couldn't be undone. But Jesus says, no, we have to do that hard work. We have to do this unscrambling. And as soon as we decide that no one is our enemy, what do we do to make it so that we can love them? And once again, a lot of us might see ourselves. I know it's very easy for me to identify with the empowered rather than the disinherited. But in this chapter, he repeatedly comes back to teaching the powerless how to love even in the worst of situations. And he encourages them to do one thing. It's necessary, we have to see each other as human. It is necessary for the privileged and the underprivileged to work on the common environment for the purpose of providing normal experiences of fellowship. This is one very important reason for the insistence that segregation is a complete and moral evil. When we have no contact with each other, when we have no way to interact and perceive the other as just like us, we use phrases like, we need to walk a mile in their shoes, whoever they are, to really understand them. And Jesus' insistence of the humanity of each other is what enables us to move to a place of love and move apart from this entanglement of the resentments that have come through in the past. The first step towards love is common sharing of mutual value, of mutual worth and value. This cannot be discovered in a vacuum or in a series of artificial or hypothetical relationships. It has to be in a real situation, natural, free. And when he talks about that, it's coming to folks both fully empowered by who we are, and as Christians, we would see that as by whose we are, and who God has made us to be, that we can walk in and have interactions with anyone, and that we are, we stripped away of the status. We're going to come back to that later. But once we come to terms as equals, we can really see where we can have relationships and be in a loving, mutually respectful relationship with anyone. Now, the thing is it going to be the same back and forth? No. But it can be. And you have to stay in a situation long enough to where that can be realized. And often that is a long, painful process. It's not something easy. Knots don't get untied overnight, especially when they're pernicious. Two examples of this segregation that took place are Episcopal churches here in Richmond. St. Andrew's is a church on Oregon Hill. That's my home parish when I first came into the Episcopal Church. And then St. Philip's. And if you're not familiar with the stories of these two wonderful churches, fantastic priest at both of these. St. Andrew's was founded by a woman who inherited her money from Lewis Ginter. If you've ever heard of Ginter Park on the north side of Richmond, she got all his wealth after he died. And she established many things around Richmond. Lewis Ginter Botanical Gardens, St. Andrews, St. Thomas's, the Richmond Nursing School, which is now the nursing school at VCU. Several other social service agencies stem their roots from her and her gift of this wealth. And when she founded St. Andrews, she was a member at Grace and Holy Trinity, right next to the cathedral. If you've ever been down to VCU, and you have these two magnificent churches right next to each other. And the immigrants and the poor white folks that were brought in to work at Tredegar Iron Works, particularly during the Civil War, were walking from Oregon Hill just 4 or 5 blocks away so that they could go to Grace and Holy Trinity. And some people didn't like that. Now, they were all white. They were all fellow Christians, but they were very much of a different class. And so Grace and Holy Trinity, in all its grandeur, they were uncomfortable. And so she decided that not to segregate them intentionally, but so that they would have a glorious little cathedral of their own, established St. Andrews literally 4 blocks away from Grace and Holy Trinity. And so St. Andrews was established for the white, poor, working class folks of Oregon Hill. And when people would go into St. Andrews, and this plaque is still on the wall to this day, as you walk into the narthex, there's a plaque that says all seats free. So every year when we raise money for our church, we do it by asking for pledges, and that people will pledge a part of their income. Back before, they made it easier. Here, this is my family's pew. I'm going to buy this pew for this year. I will subscribe to this pew for this year. And that was your family's pew. It gave your family a place to sit. And when you brought your guests in from out of town, they could sit in your pew with you. If you go to some of the more historic churches, like Pohick up in Northern Virginia, where George Washington was on the vestry, he had his family pew, and nobody could sit in it but the Washingtons. To Christ Church in Alexandria, they had a pew there also. They were a wealthy family, and so they could afford multiple pews in multiple churches. But that class distinction dropped at St. Andrews because all seats were free, and that enabled it. But that began that segregation. And once again, here the distinguishment was class rather than race. But another example is St. Philip's, which is over on the north side, near St. Thomas's in Ginter Park. It's near North Avenue, which is an African-American neighborhood, literally 6 blocks away from St. Thomas's, which would be considered Ginter Park, which is a well-to-do white neighborhood. But St. Philip's was founded by members of St. Paul's downtown. And when after the Civil War, when they were freed, they were not required to go to their owners' churches anymore. And so the folks who were at St. Philip's were encouraged and invited and wanted, for a lot of reasons, so they would have a place of their own, to move on and establish St. Philip's, which eventually moved to where it is now, just off of North Avenue. And the history there of setting up a distinguishably different congregation, same denomination, similar in everything, except the color of the people's skin who attended. And those are 2 examples right here in town where segregation was at play, going against the teachings of Jesus. The religion of Jesus says to the disinherited, love your enemy. Take the initiative in seeking ways by which you can have the experience of a common sharing of mutual worth and value. It may be hazardous, but you must do it. For the Negro, it means that he must see the individual white man in the context of a common humanity. Now, once again, Thurman is writing to the folks, and in his context, it was the African-American who would see himself as the disinherited, on how to love the folks that were putting him against the wall, to use Thurman's language from earlier in the book. Finding that personhood in the other is the first step in finding that way towards love, which is what he wants. And going on, once the attack on the enemy's status and the individual has emerged, the underprivileged man must himself be status free. So don't define yourself by whatever it is, money, color of skin, whatever outside limitations or layers of identity you put on. That love is possible only between 2 freed spirits. When we come at that from a mutual place of love and respect, not only of the other, but of the self. This is an entirely transforming message if you think about it. And then the relationship between the weak and the strong is basically amoral, or it is characterized by a facile use of the mood of the exception. And we have these phrases in our language, present company excluded. You can say the most horrible thing out there, and if someone of the who is of the ilk of whatever you're describing is there, then you toss in this little toss-off phrase, present company excluded. Like that lets you get away with it. He is heartbreakingly honest in when he brings this up. And then he goes on and he gives this wonderful example of the centurion. If you don't remember the Bible story, a Roman centurion comes to Jesus and says, Rabbi, I have a servant who has fallen ill, and he needs healing. Will you heal him? And Jesus starts to go with him. And the centurion says, no, I don't want to waste your time. I understand authority. I've always loved that line. And just say the word, and I know that my servant will be healed. This is a guy who's used to barking orders, having his orders followed immediately. And as soon as they are, he knows that whatever he says is going to get done. And he's coming to Jesus and saying, you are a person of authority. You're a person of power. And I see that and I respect that. And because of that, I know if you say the word, it will be done. And that's when Jesus comes back and says, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And so he says the word, his servant is healed, and the centurion moves on. So in light of that context, the centurion had to take his place alongside all the rest of humanity and mingle his desires with the longing of all the desperate people of all ages. So because of his fear and out of love for his servant, who had more than a master-servant relationship, it seems, he was able to come to Jesus in utter humility. And when this happened, it was possible at once for him to scale with Jesus any height of understanding, fellowship, and love. The final barrier between the strong and the weak, between the ruler and the ruled, disappeared. So in this person who had nothing but power, coming in utter humility, was what enabled him to see Jesus for who Jesus was. It's often in our weaker moments that we can be remade, rebuilt, kind of like clay. When we're hardened and strong, it's when we're not malleable anymore. And so going further, the concept of reverence for personality then is applicable between two persons from whom, in the initial insistence, the heavy weight of status has been sloughed off. So all these layers of us defining who we are. I do this. I went to this school. This is how I grew up. This is how much money I have in my bank account. This is how little money I have in my bank account. Whatever those layers of identity are, and they're finally shaken off. Then what? Each person meets the other where he is, and there treats him as if he were where he ought to be. Here we emerge into an area where love operates, revealing a universal characteristic unbounded by special or limited circumstances. And for me, he didn't use these words, but I could not help but understand that this is what the kingdom of God is. This is what we're aiming for, where all men are treated as equals. And I'm using sexist language there. All people are treated as equals. All people are treated as sisters and brothers, without all these layers of identity that get in the way. And Jesus is very clear, though, that there seems to be an insistence that forgiveness is mandatory. And like I said, this chapter is mostly written to the disinherited, on enabling them and empowering them to love the powerful. And he gives three examples immediately. First, God forgives us. We should forgive other people because God forgives us. And that the act, whatever it was not their whole identity. It was something they did. Instead of you're a liar, you told a lie. When you take away that label of liar and hang it around somebody's neck, if you can take that off and say, I recognize you did this act, and that act hurt me, instead of you hurt me. especially if it wasn't done with intent. But the evildoer also doesn't go unpunished. That even though we have forgiven them, that societal or the areas of responsibility do not go away. Societal punishment doesn't go away. They can be entirely forgiven, but at the same time, they have to be responsible for the actions. The other night, we came in just at dusk, and there were some teenagers that were in the tippy top of a tree at the church, and it was well after dusk. You know, the sky was purple. There wasn't any orange left, and I went walking over, and I'm like, "You guys need to come down out of the tree." And they were like, "Well, it's a church. Everybody can go to church." And I said, "Yeah, but you can't climb the tree right now. You need to come down." Mostly because I was terrified that they were going to break their necks. And the only reason I even noticed that they were in the tree is because they were breaking branches off and throwing them down at each other, and just being teenagers. And I finally just said, you have to come down. And they were like, who are you to tell us what to do? And I said, well, I'm actually the priest here at the church. And I didn't have my collar on, so it was hard to tell. And they were just, well, if you're a priest, you should forgive us. And I'm like, yeah, but you still have to come out of the tree. This doesn't take away the fact it's well past the time we should be up in a tree, breaking off branches. Yeah, it was devolving quickly. But that doesn't keep me from forgiving them, but at the same time, holding them accountable for their actions. And then I wanted to really focus, and it was too long for me to type, but if you have your book, this is the last paragraph of chapter 5. And this is where it gets down to the nitty-gritty. There we go. Oops. Sorry. Okay, sorry, I was trying to turn the share off. And my computers, I think everybody's on Zoom tonight. But the final paragraph on page 108, 108 in my book, I think you guys are about 10 pages behind me, maybe 118. But it's the final paragraph in the chapter. What then is the word of the religion of Jesus to those who stand with their backs against the wall? That's the phrase that's been used throughout the book. There must be the clearest possible understanding of the anatomy of the issues facing them. They must recognize fear, deception, hatred, each for what it is. And once having done this, they must learn how to destroy these or to render themselves immune to their domination. So once we start playing with those things, fear, deception, hatred, they take over. In so great an undertaking, it will become increasingly clear that the contradictions of life are not ultimate. The disinherited will know for themselves that there is a spirit at work in life and in the hearts of men or people which is committed to overcoming the world. It is universal, knowing no age, no race, no culture, and no condition of men. For the privileged and underprivileged alike, if the individual puts at the disposal of the spirit the needful dedication and discipline, he can effectively, in the chaos of the present, the high destiny of a son of God. When he was talking about how folks could, present themselves with all those layers of status stripped off, it really did come back to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, where we don't look at the content, not the color of a skin, but the contents of a person's character. And that's really what it comes back to. My mind went to MLK because of that line from his speech. His example was Jesus Christ, that he was the Son of Man, the quintessential human, the person who he is supposed to be, who we are all supposed to be, that through his teaching, he enables us to be. So, yeah. I could chew on this chapter for weeks, but we are out of Lent as of tonight. Next week we get into Holy Week. I wanted to keep it simple. That's why I kept it short tonight. But I do want to have some conversation. So if folks want to turn their microphones on, and we can have some interaction time.
Pictures.
And Deborah and John, I think if you only use one microphone, or John, if you turn your speakers all the way down, you're getting some feedback because your microphones are picking up each other.
How's that?
I think that works. I'm not hearing an echo.
How do we get the pictures, and how do I see you? Anyone?
Sorry. I think it's that view thing we played with this morning. You're on speaker view.
I don't know.
And I'm sharing my screen, so it's hard for me to.
Yeah. Let's see what view options are. No. I had everybody initially, but then everybody disappeared. So, share screen, is that a possibility? No.
I think that'll show what's on your computer.
Yeah. Well, since I'm talking, I'll just say one thing I've written down to mention.
Yes.
As I was finishing up the chapter, I just kept at every phrase, the present dilemma we're in kept coming up, that we're all really being confronted by this pandemic, the coronavirus. And I think this is a quote from the book: "In the presence of the operation of impersonal nature, we're all available to love. The heavy weight of status is being sloughed off," and you quoted that. And I thought love can operate when each person meets the other, unbounded and freed by a catastrophic situation. So the situation we're in right now sort of levels the playing field. You know,
Yeah.
everybody needs toilet paper, everybody needs food, everybody needs to be protected and social distanced and all that. And it's almost within this context that there may be an opportunity to love our neighbor in a new way that we wouldn't have unless we were having this common catastrophic situation. Does that make sense?
It very much does. I'm not trying to be crass here, but because I saw it yesterday, it's fresh in my mind.
Okay.
I've got a friend who's African American, and he put up on Facebook yesterday, he goes, are you feeling the pinch? Have you lost your job? Are you forced to stay in your house? Do you not know where to turn for help? Welcome to being Black. And that was painful.
Yeah.
I winced. That our new normal isn't new for a lot of folks. You know, and
this leveling of the playing field in some ways, but certainly very much not in other ways, in that,
yes,
you know, I have a job and my paycheck is still coming for now, but there are many types of labor where the paychecks ended. So
with no warning.
We're all being impacted. We might all get sick, but the playing field is maybe even more extreme in this time of desperation, more of a gap, more wide with those who aren't able to support themselves now.
Very much so. I had another friend who talked about how wonderful this has been. It's been a spiritual retreat for her, and how wonderful it's been to spend time alone and reading and in prayer, and it just reeked of all the privilege that she had that enabled her, while so many folks are just wrestling with utter terror, both of what we're going through and what the future holds.
Well, and also domestic violence, add stress into a pact, privilege gives us space.
Right.
I think everyone on the screen has a lot of space around them, and you have a small house and a lot of people in it, and you have domestic issues that can be very frightening, and you don't have school to escape to, you don't have your job to escape to, you're there. And now we're told we're not allowed to leave our homes except for food. And so that's quite a dangerous situation for some people.
Very much so. Thanks, Julie. What else?
So, regarding this time, may I continue?
Yes.
I've been amazed at the kindnesses of people that were just kind of random. And there was a person in Food Line who was a checkout person. I was going through it. I'd been unable to buy hand sanitizer. And she said, "Well, you can have mine." And, she's an African-American person, and we've talked on and off since we moved here. But she just said, "I have this little box of mine, and I want you to have mine." I was just amazed at that. And also, in our neighborhood, we're pretty much the only white people here, and the African-American people all around us have reached out to us. Now, maybe it's because we have gray hair and we're old, but old looking, but the kindness of people the extension of people we don't even know intimately or even, has been striking.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about that, and then I read this chapter about love. I realized how much opportunity is here. And I know that there's a lot of problems that I'm not experiencing because of my own privilege. I realize that. But there are opportunities at the next level. There are opportunities to intervene, and sometimes just an opportunity that is responded to can make the difference in a psychological state of a person. And I'm just going to keep that awareness in front of me, because I haven't seen a lot of other situations since we moved down here that have presented that much opportunity, because people seem quite segregated by choice. This is the first situation I've seen where there isn't segregation, really.
Well, he gave that wonderful example in the book of the tragedy in Portland.
Yes.
Where the underprivileged neighborhood with African Americans and Japanese, I think he said, and Native Americans were moved in, and that was the great equalizer. Their shared tragedy became their shared humanity.
Right. And I don't think it's going to fix everything, but I think as I say, I think it's an opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. It's an amazing opportunity to just totally get us off the rails and think about things completely differently.
Right. Yeah, like not get back to normal, but have a new normal that emerges from this experience. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
I saw somebody online describe it as we are now building the after. And what do we want our after to be? Where we're loving on each other and taking care of each other, we are slowing down and appreciating the best things in life, or go back to the rat race, and the division and the animosity that led us into this. It was a wake-up call. I'd never seen anybody put a name on it before, and that's why I think it stuck. But the after,
The after.
both words were capitalized.
Mm. Well, how do you hold on to these operational constructs that make so much sense when you are out of the crisis? You know, how do you hold on to that? I think that's, for me, the question, because people do go back to their ways. There's all kinds written about that too. So that would be really great to think about how to hold on to what we learned during this crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe that forgiveness for the past is essential, but it almost seems equally important to act in the present. Both have to happen.
And one of the things that I've been deeply moved by in the interactions with the Triangle of Hope folks, as we were coming to the situation as equals, we worked really hard to make that happen, even though we're differently privileged in each of our cultures, is to start almost every conversation with the words, what can I do for you? What can I learn from you? And I like the centurion being stripped of all his power, coming with an air of humility, and an air and a teachable spirit, enables a lot of powerful conversations, that everyone we see, everyone we meet is a gift to us, that we have a lesson to learn from them that only they can teach us. And were we to continue in our conversations and our interactions, that would really change the world a lot. I know when I bump into somebody, I don't have a very big world right now. I leave my house and I walk to church, but every third walk or so back and forth between my house and the church, somebody will be walking their dog or whatever. And before, I would not have stopped and talked, but now I have no problem talking to utter strangers. And how are you? How's your family doing? Are you guys faring well? Does the pup like you at home all the time? And all these little conversations that are coming out. I like that layer of respectability, to look at it from a privileged perspective, or that air of independence has been stripped away, and that now we're in a place where we can greet the stranger, rather than avoid or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was taking a walk yesterday, walking up the tracks over by the tennis courts, and someone across the tracks stopped and was yelling at me and said, look, in the field between the car and the tennis courts, there were all these deer. There were probably 5 or 6 deer. And I was touched by that on so many levels, because first of all, it was this complete, I thought, well, it must be someone I know. But it wasn't. It was a complete stranger, and who just wanted me to see that because it filled him and he wanted to share it with somebody. And then also the fact that because there are so many fewer people out, nature started to fill in, with probably 6 or 7 deer that I could see, just right near the train tracks and in what's normally an open area with people. So just really interesting, touched me on a number of levels.
Yep.
Sort of interesting, Julie. I can't see you. I'm just talking to this blank screen. But anyway, it's just interesting to listen to that, because it seems like we have more time to notice and to listen than we've ever had before. I know as a retired person, my second year in retirement, that's the thing that I've noticed more than anything else is I have time and I'm paying attention, and I think about all the things I missed when I was working so hard and my brain was full. And this has made everybody stop and have time. It's really great. Wish I could see you all.
This is me here. I just unmuted my mic. Can you hear me? Deborah should turn her mic off.
I just turned her mic off.
Mine's off.
You did.
Can you hear me now? No.
So Deborah, if you can turn your volume down.
Yeah, I'm doing that.
All right.
I'm turning it off, actually.
Keep that bit.
Okay.
No, keep it moved out.
Yeah, go.
There we go.
Yes, running around our office here. Can you hear me out there?
Yes.
Yeah, just nod if you can. Getting back to the book and what we've been thinking about there. Last weekend we heard another sermon, not just rocks. We did hear it was rock, but we also heard another one during the weekend. And it was about the two stories that Jesus told in conjunction with each other, one about a Pharisee praying and one about a tax collector praying.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a parable or story with many meanings, I'm sure, but one of the things that came out strongly when we were thinking about it was the fact that Jesus chose as a better example of sincerity and prayer, the tax collector, and even appointed the tax collector to his 12 disciples.
Yes.
Forget which one, but there is one there somewhere. Oh, Matthew, maybe.
Matthew, yep.
And it's kind of part of the sloughing off of all the crusts of prejudice that surround us and the hatred and the things we've been talking about. But until they've gone, there's not a lot of freedom to love somebody as unreservedly as he did the tax collector in his story. And if the story was exaggerated, it still made good sense to me that everything does have to go. And then you're completely free to love. There's nothing stopping you then, whether it's in your family or in the church or between somebody who's got his back against the wall and somebody who hasn't.
Mm-hmm. And if you think about all the examples that are held up as Jesus pointing to them as ways to love, we have the tax collector in that prayer. Interesting side note, before people would pray like this, and they would have a hat on to cover their head. Well, the men would anyways. And in that prayer, it talks about how he could not even look to heaven, because that's why you would do this, so that you could open yourself to heaven. But it said that he couldn't even look to heaven, and he beat his chest, asking God to forgive him, a sinner. And he said, this man went home righteous, which is why we bow our heads to this day. We take our hats off. We've reversed what was always the norm and the expectation on a stance in prayer. But the woman caught in the well, or the woman at the well, who was a Samaritan, the woman who was caught in adultery, those without sin cast the first stone, where he does not shame her. And that would be that second group. The tax collector was the shamed. The Samaritans were the shamed. The woman caught in adultery was the shamed. And Jesus, in all of those stories, flips it so that the people who society says should be shamed are the ones that are held up as closer to God. Yeah, it's a powerful stuff.
So one word we haven't used this evening, I think, is I have that echo, so I'm sorry.
I just turned mine off.
But the idea of avoiding judgment of our friends and neighbors and other people. that could be added to what's already a very full chapter, but getting past the point where you have to judge the tax collector, you're then free to love him very openly.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of forgiveness is what it links with, I suppose.
Right. Forgiveness is mandatory.
There you go.
As we said, yeah. And that's both ways, both for the people against the wall and the empowered. Yeah. Sally and Johnny, you guys have anything?
Yeah. The comment I would have to some of the discussion and, how do we keep the good part of what's happening right now as far as compassion for your neighbor and all that is, I guess what Thurman was after is that you make it some type of action. Love is an action. It'd be an action or a demand that we have to model the behavior ourselves and then ask others to try to, do what we would do. So that's kind of what I get out of it as far as, like in the condition that we're in this very moment, going forward, how do we want things to change for the better is to be more active. I think myself, I tend to, assume that, all right, good people are going to prevail and the right outcome is going to happen. But as you get older, it just seems like we're more divisive and, there is, I feel like we're fighting a lot of the civil rights movement over again. And it just boggles my mind because to me, it seems like we did that. We did that in the 60s, and we have much more, the laws require equality and equal rights and, but people that maybe are younger, they don't feel like they're experiencing that in society, even though the laws are there. And that fight was already fought. But, so I think we have to just be more active in, how we're going to require people to be more Jesus-like.
Powerful words. Thank you. Well, anything else, friends? All right. It's been a powerful book. Thank you for being with us. If there's anything you want to go back and revisit, I've recorded this and we'll have this up so you can watch it on our YouTube channel. But I really do appreciate you guys sticking through to the end, and I appreciate you taking the time to wrestle with this book. I've forgotten how good it was. I knew I liked it. I didn't know I loved it this much. So.
Yeah, thank you, Rod, for the amount of time that you put into working on this and sharing it with us.
Oh, you're very welcome. My joy.
Yes, thank you, Rod.
You're welcome.
I have to say, I'm as much as I did appreciate the book, it seemed a little bit over my head at times, and I'm very glad that now I get to focus on the lamb. I'm ready for the humor right now. I'm just, the darkness is kind of too much for me at this point.
That's fair, Aaron. I appreciate that. For those of you who weren't part of the Lamb book group, we have 3 extra copies here at the church. So if you want a good book to read while you're quarantined, next time you run an errand, stop by the church and grab one of the copies that are here, because it really is a fun book. I think Aaron would attest.
Absolutely. It's very lighthearted, and it makes a lot of light of things that in a very dark time. It's a good book to read.
It's a refreshing perspective. It's not all lighthearted. The end gets a little heavy, but
oh well, I'm not there yet, so.
But it's an
Spoiler alert
ride to the end. Yes. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Many blessings, and everybody have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Good night, everybody.
Right.
Take care.
Oh, there we go.
Went
I figured it out. I was pushing the wrong button.
Hello.
Hi.
That's a much better view. Okay, y'all take care.
Good night.
Bye.